Tracy Williams, a skilled corporate fixer, is in the midst of a high-stakes negotiation with Jin-Woo Park, a powerful Korean mafia boss whose empire is built on control and danger. As the deal progresses, Tracy's heart races, not only from the weight of the deal, but from the hidden feelings she's buried for years. For years, she's navigated a dangerous tightrope, balancing her legal work with Jean's criminal empire, while secretly battling an attraction to the man she's supposed to fear. After finalizing the deal, Tracy's colleagues, Amanda, Jennifer, and Karen, crowd around her, teasing her about the undeniable chemistry between her and the monster she's been negotiating with. In a moment of weakness, Tracy cracks, confesses, and realizes that her life will never be the same again. Before I tell you what happened next to Tracy, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. This video will leave you astonished. Now, let's dive into it.
Tracy Williams stared at her phone screen, the digital numbers blurred by the stinging sweat in her eyes. The call timer had just hit 43 minutes, the longest, most grueling negotiation of her career. Across the line, the silence of Jin-Woo Park was always more terrifying than his threats. But she had done it. She had secured the shipping ports without a single drop of blood being spilled. "Is he gone?" Jennifer asked, her voice barely a whisper. She smoothed her blue blouse, her eyes darting to the sleek device on the mahogany table. Tracy nodded, her body sagging into her executive chair as if the bones had suddenly turned to lead. Lines did. We're safe. The tension in the room snapped like a violin string. Amanda and Karen let out synchronized exhales, moving toward Tracy's desk. In the sterile, high-end glow of the Williams & Associates office, they looked like survivors of a silent war. "My God, Tracy," Karen breathed, leaning against the glass partition. "How do you do it? You talk to that man like he's just another board member, not a wolf in a three-piece suit." "He's not just a wolf," Amanda added, fanning herself with a stack of legal briefs. "He's the alpha. Did you hear his voice when he lowered the octave? I thought I was going to faint, and I'm just the paralegal." Tracy pressed her cold palms against her burning cheeks. She was the ice queen, the elite fixer who never flinched, yet her heart was currently performing a violent, erratic rhythm against her ribs. For 3 years, she had been the bridge between the law and the Park Empire. For 3 years, she had maintained a mask so perfect it had become a second skin. "It's just business," Tracy murmured, though the lie tasted like ash. "Bullshit," Jennifer countered, leaning in with a knowing smirk. "I saw your hand shaking when he called you Tracy instead of counselor. There's enough electricity between you two to power the entire Seoul skyline." Tracy looked at her friends, the only people who saw the woman behind the blazer. The exhaustion, the adrenaline, and the 3 years of suppressed yearning suddenly boiled over. The secret was a physical weight, a stone in her chest that she needed to drop before it crushed her. "I can't keep doing this," Tracy whispered, covering her mouth with one hand as her eyes widened with a sudden, frightening clarity. "What doing?" Karen asked softly.
"Pretending," Tracy said, her voice cracking. "I've spent every day for 3 years terrified he'll see through me. Not because of the deals, but because I'm in love with him. I'm completely, hopelessly in love with a man who could have me erased with a single phone call." The room went silent. Amanda gasped, and Jennifer's hand flew to her chest. Tracy felt a strange, terrifying lightness. She had finally said it. Then the silence changed. It wasn't the silence of the room. It was the electronic hum of a speaker. Tracy's gaze dropped to the phone. The screen wasn't black. The green active call bar was glowing like a radioactive bruise. 4412, 4413. The blood drained from Tracy's face so fast the world tilted. Her heart didn't just stop, it plummeted. Across the city, in an office filled with shadows and the scent of expensive whiskey, the line was still open, and Jean-Woo Park had heard everything. The sun had barely begun to crest over the skyline the following morning when the heavy glass doors of the firm swung open with a predatory deliberateness. Tracy sat at her desk, her eyes rimmed with red from a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sky to fall. When he entered, the air in the room didn't just chill, it vanished. Jean-Woo Park was a vision of sharp edges and tailored intimidation. He wore a three-piece suit of slate gray, the fabric shimmering with a subtle, expensive sheen that made him look like a statue carved from industrial steel. The black tie was knotted with military precision, and as he adjusted his cuffs, the ink of a dragon's tail peeked out from beneath his sleeve, a reminder of the violence that paid for the elegance. Amanda and Karen froze by the coffee station, their breath hitching in unison. Jennifer, usually the first to offer a professional greeting, found herself pinned to her chair by the sheer gravity of his presence. Jean-Woo didn't look at them. His dark, hooded eyes were fixed solely on Tracy. He walked toward her desk with a slow, rhythmic stride, his leather shoes clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. Without a word, he reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. He placed it on the center of her desk, right on top of a stack of pending litigation. With a flick of his thumb, he hit play. "Because I'm in love with him. I'm completely, hopelessly in love with a man who could have me erased with a single phone call." Tracy's own voice, raw and desperate, echoed through the quiet office. The recording was crystal clear, the sound of her soul being stripped bare. Tracy felt a wave of nausea roll over her, her hands clenching into fists beneath the desk to hide their violent tremors.
"You have a very expressive voice, counselor," Jean-Woo said. His tone was like velvet stretched over granite, low, smooth, and dangerously calm. He didn't wait for her to respond. Instead, he reached into a letter folder he carried and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It wasn't a legal contract. It was a ledger. At the bottom was a number that made Tracy's stomach drop, a debt so massive it was effectively a death sentence. "Your brother, Tommy, has a very expensive habit," Jean-Woo continued, leaning forward until the scent of cedarwood and expensive tobacco clouded Tracy's senses. "He owes my associates more than his life is worth. In fact, the collection team was scheduled to visit him this morning. I told them to wait." Tracy looked from the recording to the debt, the trap closing around her with agonizing precision. "What do you want, Jean-Woo?" He straightened, his expression unreadable, though a flicker of something, triumph or perhaps a darker hunger shone in his eyes. "My family elders are demanding I solidify my image. They want a wife who understands power and discretion, someone who can hold a room and keep a secret." He paused, his gaze dropping to the phone on the desk. "You've spent 3 years pretending you don't want me. Now you'll spend 6 months pretending you do. I clear your brother's slate and you wear my ring. A fair trade for a confession, don't you think?" The silence that followed Jean-Woo's ultimatum was heavy, thick with the scent of his expensive cologne and the metallic tang of Tracy's own fear. She looked down at the gold-rimmed fountain pen he had placed atop the engagement contract. The paper looked innocent enough, cream-colored heavyweight vellum, but to Tracy it was a shroud. "6 months?" she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain the ice queen her colleagues admired. "You're asking me to sell my life for a lie." "I am asking you to trade a performance for your brother's survival," Jean-Woo corrected. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He looked perfectly at home in her office, as if he already owned the space, the firm, and the woman sitting across from him. Tommy is currently at a warehouse in the docks. My men are remarkably patient, but their patience has a price. Tracy looked toward the door. Through the frosted glass, she could see the blurred silhouettes of Amanda, Jennifer, and Karen. They were waiting for her to save the day, unaware that the savior was being dismantled piece by piece. She thought of Tommy, reckless, smiling Tommy, who had always looked up to her. If she didn't sign this, the next call she received wouldn't be a negotiation. It would be a recovery request.
With a hand that felt disconnected from her body, Tracy reached for the pen. The metal was warm from his touch. She scrawled her name at the bottom of the document, the ink bleeding into the paper like a fresh bruise. She slammed the pen down, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "There, you have what you wanted. You have your puppet." She looked up at him, her eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and the very love she had accidentally confessed. "You really are a monster, Jean Wu. You heard a woman admit she had feelings for you, and your first instinct wasn't to reciprocate or even to walk away. It was to find a way to use those feelings as a leash." Jean Wu didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He stood up, slowly buttoning the jacket of his gray suit, smoothing the fabric over his broad shoulders. He picked up the signed contract, folding it with clinical precision before tucking it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. He stepped around the desk, invading her personal space until she was forced to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He reached out, his gloved thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt more threatening than a blade. "You're right, Tracy," he murmured, his voice dropping to that lethal melodic octave that always made her pulse betray her. "I am a monster. The world we live in, the world your brother stepped into, and the world you've been fixing for years is filled with them. There are men out there who would take your confession and destroy you just for the sport of it." He leaned down, his lips brushing against her shell of ear, his breath hot against her skin. "But remember this, I am the only monster who can keep the others away from you. From this moment on, you are mine, and I protect what is mine." He pulled back, giving her one last unreadable look before turning on his heel. As the glass doors closed behind him, Tracy collapsed back into her chair, the weight of the diamond ring he had left on her desk sparkling with a cold, mocking brilliance. The following Monday, the first delivery arrived. It wasn't just a bouquet, it was a statement. A tall crystal vase housing a dozen obsidian black roses was placed squarely on the reception desk, their petals so dark they looked like they had been dipped in midnight. Jennifer and Karen immediately swarmed the delivery, their excitement echoing through the polished marble halls of the firm. "Tracy, you have to see these," Jennifer called out, her voice high with romantic envy. She adjusted her blue blouse, leaning in to inhale a scent that was surprisingly sweet for flowers that looked so lethal. "I've never seen anything like them. They're gorgeous. He really is trying to make up for that terrifying entrance last week, isn't he?" Tracy stood in her office doorway, her hands gripped tightly behind her back. To her colleagues, the roses were a symbol of a powerful man's courtship, an extravagant, slightly gothic gesture of affection.
But Tracy had spent 3 years studying the nuances of the Park Empire. She knew that in the silent, violent language of the Korean underworld, the black rose carried a weight far heavier than romance. It was a mark of absolute possession. It meant the recipient was under the protection and the total control of the sender. "They're just flowers, Jen," Tracy said, her voice sounding hollow to her own ears. "They aren't just flowers," Karen countered, pointing to the small, thick card tucked into the foliage. It bore no signature, only a hand-drawn emblem of a coiled dragon. This is a statement. He's claiming you in front of the whole world. It's like a fairy tale, Tracy. A dark one, sure, but still a fairy tale. Tracy walked over and took the card. The paper was heavy, the same high-quality vellum as the engagement contract. As the days passed, the roses didn't stop. Every morning at 8 a.m., a new vase appeared. The office began to look like a shrine of shadows. The air grew thick with the cloying, heavy scent of the blooms, a constant reminder of the invisible walls closing in around her. Her colleagues grew more enamored with the romance with every delivery, but Tracy felt like a prisoner watching the bars of her cell being gilded in gold. Each black petal was a link in the chain Jean Wu had forged the moment she accidentally left that line open. Late on the fourth evening, as the cleaning crew moved through the lobby, Tracy stood alone before the latest bouquet. She reached out, her finger brushing a petal that felt like velvet-covered steel. She realized then that Jean Wu wasn't just sending a message to her, he was sending a warning to the rest of the city. He was announcing that the Ice Queen of Williams & Associates was no longer a neutral party. She was his, and in their world, what belonged to the Mafia boss was untouchable by everyone except him. The phone on her desk vibrated. A text from an unknown number simply read, "Do you like the color, Tracy? It matches the soul of the man you claim to love." She didn't have to ask who it was. The trap wasn't just about a contract or a debt anymore. It was about the slow, deliberate consumption of her identity. He was turning her world black, one rose at a time. The car that arrived to collect Tracy for the dinner was a silent black predator that seemed to swallow the evening light. As they pulled into the sprawling park estate, the gates felt less like an entrance and more like the closing of a trap. Tracy smoothed the silk of her charcoal-colored gown, the fabric as cold and unforgiving as her resolve. On her finger, the diamond ring Jean Wu had forced upon her felt like a lead weight, yet she wore it like armor. Jean Wu was waiting for her at the base of the grand staircase. He looked devastating in a black tuxedo, his presence so commanding it seemed to pull the oxygen from the hallway.
He didn't offer a romantic greeting. He simply scanned her from head to toe, his eyes lingering on the sharp, professional line of her jaw.
"The others are in the formal dining hall," he said, his voice a low vibration. "They expect to find a weakness. They think you are a mere ornament I've chosen to soften my image."
Tracy met his gaze with a look of pure frost. "Then they haven't been paying attention to my track record for the last 3 years." They entered the lion's den to a heavy, judgmental silence. 4 elderly men and 2 women sat at a table of polished obsidian, their eyes sharp with decades of tradition and suspicion. These were the architects of the park empire, the people who decided who lived and who was erased. The interrogation began before the first course was served. A lawyer, the eldest man, Chairman Park, spat the word like it was an insult. "Jean Wu, you bring a woman who lives by the rules of the state into a house that makes its own. How can she possibly understand the weight of our legacy?" Tracy didn't wait for Jean Wu to defend her. She set her wine glass down with a deliberate, audible click that cut through the chairman's voice. "I don't just live by the rules, Chairman," Tracy said, her voice dropping into that clinical Ice Queen register that had dismantled CEOs. "I navigate the spaces between them. For the last 3 years, I have shielded your shipping interests from 3 federal investigations and 2 hostile takeovers without a single one of you seeing the inside of a courtroom." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto the chairman's. "You value legacy, I value results.
While you sit here debating my worth, I have already drafted the restructuring of the port holdings to ensure your grandchildren's inheritance remains untouchable by the IRS. I am not an ornament. I am the reason your empire still has a foundation to stand on." A stunned silence descended. Jean Wu sat perfectly still, his glass of whiskey halfway to his lips. He watched Tracy with an expression she had never seen before, not the calculating gaze of a boss or the manipulative heat of a blackmailer, but genuine, unadulterated respect. The tension in the room shifted. The elders looked at one another, their posturing replaced by a wary acknowledgement of a superior intellect. Tracy didn't smile. A queen didn't need to. She simply picked up her fork and began to eat, having successfully conquered the room before the appetizers were cleared. Beside her, Jean Wu reached beneath the table. For the first time, his hand found hers, not to squeeze or to possess, but a brief, firm pressure, a silent salute from one predator to another.
The drive back from the Park estate was cloaked in a heavy, contemplative silence. The city lights smeared across the bulletproof windows like streaks of neon paint, but inside the car the atmosphere was thick with the unresolved tension of the evening. Tracy leaned her head against the cool leather headrest, her eyes closed, still feeling the adrenaline of the confrontation with the elders. Yin Wu hadn't spoken since they left the gates. He sat beside her, the scent of his cedarwood cologne mixing with the faint, lingering aroma of the expensive scotch he'd favored at dinner. When the car finally glided to a halt in the private underground garage of his penthouse, he didn't move to open the door. He simply sat there, watching the digital clock on the dashboard flip to midnight. "You were impressive tonight," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the cramped space. "The elders don't usually stay silent for anyone. They certainly don't stay silent for a fixer." Tracy turned her head to look at him, her expression guarded. "I did what was necessary for the contract, Yin Wu. I played the part." "Is that all it was? A part?" He turned toward her, his silhouette sharp against the dim garage lighting. He reached out, his gloved fingers catching a stray lock of her dark hair and tucking it behind her ear. The touch was lingering, almost hesitant. "You've become very good at hiding behind your work, Tracy. You use your brilliance like a shield, hoping no one looks long enough to see the cracks." Tracy felt her heart hammer against her ribs, that familiar, traitorous rhythm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Yin Wu let out a short, humorless huff of a laugh. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the same device that had broadcast her secret to the world. But he didn't play the recording, he simply held it in his palm. "Do you really think I'm unobservant?" he asked, his eyes pinning her to the seat. "Do you think I haven't noticed the way your pupils dilate when I walk into a room, or the way you hold your breath for exactly 3 seconds every time I say your name? I've watched you for 3 years, Tracy. I didn't need a phone call to tell me how you felt." Tracy froze, the air leaving her lungs in a sharp hiss. The Ice Queen felt her throne melting beneath her. "You knew?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Before the call, you already knew?" "I knew," he confirmed, leaning closer until their foreheads almost touched. "I was waiting. I wanted to see how long you could maintain the lie. I wanted to see if you would ever be brave enough to step out from behind your desk and reach for what you wanted." He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips. "The open line wasn't an accident of fate, Tracy. It was the moment you finally broke, and I was simply there to catch the pieces."
The revelation was more crushing than the blackmail. He hadn't just trapped her, he had been watching her trap herself for years, enjoying the show. Tracy felt a surge of indignation, but it was quickly swallowed by the sheer, overwhelming magnetic pull of the man in front of her.
In the silence of midnight, the masks were finally gone, leaving nothing but the dangerous, beautiful truth of what they were to each other. The following morning, the office was stifling, the air heavy with the cloying scent of the 100th black rose Jean Wu had sent. Tracy sat at her desk, the midnight confession still echoing in her mind like a physical bruise. Every time she looked at the phone, she felt the weight of his admission that he had been watching her, waiting for her to crumble. Amanda and Jennifer were near the glass partition, discussing a new merger, their voices a comforting hum of normalcy. Tracy tried to focus on the brief in front of her, but her instincts, honed by years of a life she had tried to bury, were screaming. The street below was too quiet. The black sedan idling at the curb had been there 3 minutes too long. "Get down!" Tracy screamed, her voice cutting through the office calm like a blade. An instant later, the world turned into a storm of crystalline shards. The floor-to-ceiling windows detonated inward as a hail of high-caliber rounds shredded the mahogany furniture. Jennifer screamed, diving behind a filing cabinet as Amanda collapsed to the floor, covering her head. Through the gaping hole where the window had been, 4 shadows swung in on tactical ropes, the Crimson Dragons. They were dressed in matte black, their faces obscured by ballistic masks, suppressed submachine guns raised to finish the job. They weren't here for a negotiation, they were here for an execution. In that heartbeat, the Ice Queen lawyer died. Tracy didn't think, she reacted. The years of deep-cover training, the muscle memory of a federal operative who had survived the worst corners of the world, flooded back. As the first assassin landed, Tracy kicked her heavy desk chair into his path, tripping his momentum. Before he could level his weapon, she was on him. She didn't use a gavel or a pen. She used the heavy crystal vase, the one holding Jean Wu's black roses. She shattered it against the side of the assassin's helmet, the water and dark petals spraying across the floor like ink and blood. As he stumbled, she twisted his arm with a sickening pop, disarming him in a fluid motion that was terrifyingly graceful. She didn't stop. She used the captured weapon's stock to drive into the throat of the second attacker, her movements a blur of lethal precision. Amanda and Karen watched from the floor, their eyes wide with a new kind of horror. This wasn't the woman who mentored them. This was a predator who moved with a cold, rhythmic violence that rivaled Jean Wu himself.
The third dragon leveled his gun at the cowering Jennifer. Tracy vaulted over a shattered desk, her body a streak of charcoal silk. She tackled in midair, spinning them both into the wreckage of the conference table. She struck 2 pressure points in his neck with her thumb, dropping him instantly into unconsciousness. Standing amidst the glass and the fallen men, Tracy breathed heavily, a single red streak of blood running down her cheek from a glass nick. She looked at the weapon in her hand, then at her terrified colleagues. The mask wasn't just cracked, it was gone. The secret was out, and as the sirens began to wail in the distance, Tracy knew the lawyer was never coming back. The sirens were a distant wail against the heavy silence that followed the violence. Tracy stood in the center of the wreckage, her knuckles grazed and her breathing shallow, holding a tactical submachine gun with the practiced ease of someone who had carried one for a lifetime. The elevator doors hissed open, and Jean Wu burst into the room, his gray suit jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of the dragon on his forearms. He had a weapon drawn, his eyes scanning for threats, but he stopped dead when he saw the scene. 4 elite Crimson Dragon assassins lay broken on the floor. Tracy stood over them, her charcoal silk dress torn at the shoulder, her gaze cold and analytical. "Tracy?" Jean Wu's voice was a low, fractured rasp. He looked at the disarmed attackers, then back at the woman he thought he had been protecting. "What is this? How did you—" "Check the perimeter, Jean Wu," Tracy snapped, her voice stripped of its corporate softness. It was the command of a field lead. "The elevator is compromised. Use the service stairs, now." Jean Wu didn't move. He watched as she efficiently cleared the chamber of the captured weapon, engaged the safety, and tucked a spare magazine into the waistband of her gown. The Ice Queen lawyer had been replaced by something far more dangerous, a tactical expert who moved with a lethal rhythmic economy. "You're not a lawyer," he whispered, the realization hitting him harder than any physical blow. Tracy finally looked at him, the red streak on her cheek making her eyes appear even brighter. "I was a deep cover operative, Jean Wu. 6 years ago, I was recruited by a federal task force. My mission wasn't to represent you. It was to infiltrate your organization, map your assets, and provide the evidence needed to dismantle the Park Empire from the inside." The air in the room seemed to freeze. Jean Wu's grip on his own gun tightened, his expression a mask of betrayed fury and sudden, agonizing clarity. 3 years? He said, his voice dropping to a dangerous octave. Every deal, every late-night call, every rose, it was all part of the mission?
"It was," Tracy said, her voice finally wavering. She stepped toward him, ignoring the glass crunching under her heels. "Until it wasn't. I had enough evidence to bury you twice over by the end of the first year, but I never filed the reports. I buried the files, I scrubbed the digital trail, and I stayed. I told myself I was waiting for a bigger fish, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't do it. I couldn't destroy the man I had spent every hour trying to understand." She reached out, but stopped herself, her hand hovering in the space between them. "I'm a traitor to my agency because of you, and you're a monster who used my heart as leverage. I suppose that makes us even." Jean Wu looked at the woman who had just saved his life, the woman who had been his greatest threat and his secret protector. The shock in his eyes began to melt, replaced by a dark, shimmering intensity. Before he could speak, the stairwell door kicked open, and more shadows moved in the hallway. "Later," Jean Wu commanded, stepping in front of her, his body a shield. "Right now, we get out of here alive." The chaos of the morning had settled into a heavy, ringing stillness. The office, once a sanctuary of corporate precision, was now a wreckage of shattered glass and blackened roses, the air smelling of gunpowder and ozone. Tracy stood by the jagged remains of the window, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face, while Jean Wu finished a low, urgent call to his cleaners. The Crimson Dragons had been neutralized, but the world they inhabited had been permanently altered. Jean Wu turned to her, his gray suit jacket long gone, the dragon on his arm stark against his pale skin. He didn't look like a boss, and he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a man who had finally seen the sun after years in the dark. From his inner pocket, he pulled out the leather folder, the one containing the engagement contract and the ledger of Tommy's crushing debts. Without a word, he produced a gold lighter. He flicked it open, the flame dancing in the drafty room. He touched the fire to the edge of the papers. Tracy watched in silence as the ink and the threats curled into black ash, floating away like the ghosts of their deceptions. "The debt is gone," Jean Wu said, his voice no longer a weapon, but a soft, jagged confession. "I orchestrated that leverage because I was a coward who didn't know how to reach you any other way. I've spent 3 years sending you signals you were the only one, while pretending it was just business. I heard your confession on that call, and my first thought was finally. My second was that you'd never forgive me for the trap I was about to set." Tracy looked at the ashes on the floor, then up at him. The Ice Queen and the operative were both gone, leaving only Tracy. "I've spent 3 years buried under a mission I couldn't complete because I loved the target more than the badge," she whispered. "I'm a mess, Jean Wu. I don't know how to be normal after this."
Jean Wu stepped into her space, his hands framing her face with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. "Good. Normal is overrated. Be real with me. Be mine." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm leaving the Empire.
I want to build something that doesn't require violence or masks. I want a life where I don't have to check for threats before I kiss you." Tracy reached up, her fingers tracing the tattoos on his forearm, the marks of his past, before locking her arms around his neck. "For the record," she murmured against his lips, "I would have said yes without the blackmail." Jean Wu smiled, a real, radiant smile she had been secretly collecting in her heart for 3 years. "I know, but I needed the excuse to finally touch you." They stood together amidst the ruins of their old lives, two predators who had decided to become partners. There were still dragons to handle and families to convince, but as they shared a kiss that tasted of promise and possibility, they were finally honest. They were finally equals. Finally, they were home.